Welcome to the stage, 76th U.S. Secretary of the Treasury and IGP Faculty Policy Director, Jack Lew.
Welcome and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to our very important across the aisle conversation, which is hosted by the Institute of Global Politics here at Columbia SIPA. This series is about reminding ourselves and showing our students how important it is to have thoughtful, respectful discussion across party and ideological lines. And that it's not only possible, but it's essential if we're going to find solutions to our country's pressing problems and if we're going to keep our democracy strong. Today's topic, the future of U.S. trade policy, is an especially fitting and timely one for this kind of dialogue. Trade is an arena where economic priorities, national security, and domestic politics all intersect. It's also an area where policy has been shaped over the years by leaders on both sides of the aisle working together to fashion durable solutions that require bipartisan support. And today, we're really fortunate to have two such leaders with us. I got to know Ambassador Robert Lighthizer back in the 1980s when he was counsel to Senator Bob Dole on the Senate Finance Committee, and I was working for Democratic Speaker of the House Thomas P. O'Neill Jr. Our bosses had very different philosophies, but they liked and respected each other, and that spirit of mutual respect carried through to their staff. Bob was already known then for his deep knowledge on trade issues and his advocacy for American manufacturing, for agriculture, for steel. He also played key roles in the Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981, as we were discussing earlier. That was back in the days when tax laws were written on the Hill, and the Senate Finance Committee was a key place where that took place. We worked together on the Social Security reforms of 1983, and he was involved in renegotiating the U.S.-Soviet grain accord. Later, as U.S. Trade Representative under President Trump, he oversaw negotiations that reshaped U.S. trade relationships, including the USMCA agreement with Mexico and Canada. Ambassador Michael Froman has been a close colleague in many different capacities, starting when he served as Chief of Staff to then Secretary of the Treasury Robert Rubin at the National Economic Council in the White House, and later as U.S. Trade Representative under President Obama. He and I worked closely on the U.S.-China strategic and economic dialogue, and he played a central role in shaping global responses during the financial crisis. And as USTR, he led the negotiations of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. What unites both Bob and Mike is not just their expertise, but the respect they earned not just within their own party, but on both sides of the aisle, for their knowledge, their integrity, and their seriousness of purpose. That makes them ideal guests for this across the aisle conversation. We're equally lucky to have our own Merit Janow here to guide the discussion. As our Dean Emerita of SIPA and a professor here at SIPA in International Economic Law and Trade Policy, she was also a former member of the WTO, World Trade Organization appellate body. She brings unmatched perspective on how trade connects to the global system and to the training the next generation of leaders. So with that, let me thank all of you for joining us, and please welcome Bob Lighthizer, Mike Froman, and our moderator, Merit Janow.
I'm the centrist.
Good morning, everyone. Great to see you all. Thank you for being here. And let me just say it's really a tremendous personal pleasure for me to moderate this discussion across the aisle and focusing on U.S. trade policy with two great experts, individuals who've been significant players, two former USTRs, and two individuals I've known for a long time. Ambassador Lighthizer from when I was at USTR working on bilateral matters, and Ambassador Froman from about that same period when you were, I think, in the White House at that time. So, as Secretary Liu said, trade policy has been an area of bipartisanship over the years. I'm hoping that today we can discuss areas where our leaders both agree and disagree. I think Ambassador Lighthizer has been particularly influential in framing current thinking about tariff policy from the period when he was USTR during the first Trump administration, and I think really gave us a very rich sense of his thinking in his subsequent book, No Trade is Free. And I think his thinking is particularly well aligned with President Trump. And of course, tariffs have been used throughout the history of the United States as an instrument to generate revenue, as a tool of restriction, as a tool to bring reciprocity to practices and gain better access. But since January, tariffs in this country have gone from about 2% on average to now 17%. With the Liberation Day tariffs. And I think the reason for that have brought together at least those three motivations and more. And the international system is going through some profound adjustments, some which maybe we might see as incremental, building on the past, and others which are real breaks from the past. So I'm hoping in this discussion we could discuss first, how did we get here? A diagnosis from each of you, if you are willing. Then maybe discuss a few pressing issues, and then invite you to look to the future. And bringing out areas where you agree and where you disagree. So first, for some framing. Bob, since your thinking has been influential in the current environment so profoundly, could you articulate how you understand the Trump trade and tariff strategy? Is it about tariffs? Is it about revenue? Is it about leverage? What are the core problems that have motivated this approach that you think need to be addressed, and the tools that are being utilized to achieve those outcomes? How do you think it's unfolding? How do you think about the problem that we're addressing?
Well, thank you, Merritt, for the question, and it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. You started off, how did we get here? I should say how I got here today is as a tribute to Jack Lew, who I view as one of the most significant public figures in recent years. We could spend the next 49 minutes talking about him. So I want you to know, when we say, how did I get here? This is how I got here. I have enormous respect for my two colleagues on the panel, and Mike and I have done these and talked a lot, and talked when I was in USTR as well as afterwards. So with that out of the way, I asked people to think of sort of two things, right? The first thing is the trading system is broken. And it's not broken because of what President Trump did in his first term or in the last few months. It's broken because it's based on the premise that free trade exists, on the premise that countries export in order to import. And what we've really seen is a very different outcome. We've seen some countries with massive, massive trade surpluses that go on for decades. It has nothing to do with basic economics. It deals with industrial policy. It deals with subsidies. It deals with closed markets. It deals with banking systems and labor laws and all of these things designed what would have been called in the last century beggar thy neighbor. They're designed not to have trade where I export what I make best and import what I make second best. No, it's I'm trying to get rich. And that has been what has happened. Now, everybody knows the biggest culprit is China, but China's not the only culprit. There are a lot of people that have what is for them very large trade surpluses for decades. And trade's not supposed to work that way. The other side of that is when you have predators, you have victims. And the United States has been a victim. It's had very bad outcomes. Not for all Americans, I should say that clearly, because very rich people have done very well. And rich people, particularly in the coasts, have done very well. But working class people have done very poorly as a result of this. So you end up with the United States having what are really $1.5 trillion deficits if you actually added the numbers properly. But even if you take the official numbers, they're $1 trillion. And this goes on for years and years and years and years and years. So what really happens is because of other people's industrial policy, you are trading the ownership of your country, your equity, your debt, and your real estate for current consumption. And everyone in this room knows that if you produce less than you consume, you're going to get poorer. Now, everyone in this room, that assumes there are no economists in the room, because if there are economists in the room, they don't think that's true. But everyone who's not an economist in the world understands if you consume a lot more than you produce, you're getting poorer. And that's what the country has. So if you look at the net international investment position of the United States, how much Americans own all over the world versus how much other people own of us, that's a negative $26 trillion. And that's not because Americans are stupid or lazy or like to consume more. It's because we're incorporating, without defending ourselves, an industrial policy of other countries. China primarily, but also Germany and Japan for a long time, and we can talk about all of that. So the first thing is we are getting poorer. The second thing is we are seeing a system where we have relatively slower economic growth. And there's lots of data on this that everyone can see. But if you look at what's kind of happened in the last 25 years in the United States, we've had 2 years of 2% plus GDP growth, 3 years if you count the COVID year, which is kind of an abnormality, but basically 2 years, none in the last 19 years, 18 or 19 years, where we would expect normally to have 14 of those years in any 20-year period. So economic growth is slower. You've also seen, as a result of this system, less leadership in the United States on innovation, and we can talk about that. But the biggest problem is the outcomes for American working class people has been very bad. If you take as a proxy for working class people, high school educated working people, they live 8 years shorter lives. For the first time in American history, the top 1% has more wealth than the middle 60%. And I could go on and on and on with one data point after another. You see the people are dying of drugs and alcohol and suicide. You see communities wiped out if you go across, particularly across the middle part of the United States. So I would say the trade, and it's not just the United States that has suffered, but the trading system has not worked. It hasn't worked for decades. You could say maybe the biggest single mistake was letting China in the WTO, giving China permanent most favored nation treatment, which we did in the United States. You could say that was a fundamental problem. But even aside from that, you see a system that has failed America, and I would say failed a lot of other countries. The other point that I would suggest that people think about, and it's kind of a separate point, for sure the trading system has failed, and we need something different, and we had to do something, and that's why President Trump did something. The other thing that people should focus on is the extent to which China is a geopolitical adversary of the West, of the United States, and the economic ramifications of that. So that's a fundamental fact and maybe something that we can get to a little bit later. So you have a failed system. You have massive transfer of wealth from the United States overseas, and then you have to do something about it. So you have basically, people would suggest kind of 3 things you could do to move towards balance. One, something that Warren Buffett recommended in an article, which I recommend to everyone, called Thriftville and Squanderville. It's a good article. It came out with it 20 years ago, but it's still very much topical. And that is, you could have export-import certificates, right? In order to import, you have to have an export certificate, and that would lead to balance. Two, you could put in place a system of capital access fees, so the dollars that come back to the United States are not worth as much. And then the third tool really is tariffs, and that's the one that the president picked. It's the one I certainly think is the most reasonable one. It's flexible. We have laws that deal with it. Every country in the world has a structure that deals with tariffs. So one way to move towards balance, to correct this system, is the imposition of tariffs. And so that is what the president has chosen. I think it's the right approach. We began the process of moving people in the direction of understanding this system has failed during the first term. The Biden administration did not reverse that. They kept that in place. Really an admission that they agreed that there are fundamental problems. And now the president's taking the next natural step. So anyway, that's kind of how we see it. It's a failed system. It's failed for a long period of time. That isn't to say that everything that happened since the Second World War was bad. It was a system that made sense for a long period of time. It has a number of accomplishments, but that for the last 2 or 3 decades, it's been very bad for the United States. I would say very bad for a lot of other countries too. And so we needed to change. We need a new system.
Well, thank you. Let me invite Ambassador Froman, Mike, if I may. The heart of what Ambassador Lighthizer is stressing is that the international trading system that was set up, and by implication, the multiple rounds of multilateral negotiations that reduced U.S. tariffs, has failed the American people. And that the problems we're facing in this country, the decline in manufacturing implied, is really due to the international trading system. What is your perspective on that?
Great. Well, first of all, thank you. Let me just reinforce the fan club for Jack and for Merritt. And it's great to be here at SIPA, and great to be with Ambassador Lighthizer as well. Look, let me think about where to start on that question and on Bob's layout of the Trump administration's approach. First, I think, as he said near the end, I think the global trading system has had a number of accomplishments in the post-war period. And it was true that the U.S. was asymmetric in its approach to trade. The view was we would let Japan and Germany reconstruct itself, and let Europe get back on its feet by giving them more access to us than we had to them, because we thought it was in our interest that we had a growing global economy. And that sort of sentiment led to a few decades of work to say, actually, the global trading system, through integration, through these reducing tariffs in these various multilateral rounds, has the effect of allowing poverty to be alleviated at a rate that had not been seen in human history. Hundreds of millions, if not more than 1 billion people lifted out of poverty because of the global trading system. We should talk about the more recent decades that Bob rightfully points. At that point, you've got a number of major emerging economies. You've got, obviously, Europe and Japan very much on their own feet, and yet still, in some cases, pursuing policies that have a negative impact on the U.S., and whether or not there was enough done to adjust it at that point. But let me just say a word about the United States as an economy. We are, for all of the negativity, we are the most productive, one of the most productive, certainly the most innovative economy in the world still, where most of the innovations are happening, including at great universities like Columbia. And it's the reason why people want to come to the U.S., why they want to study here, why they want to build their companies here, and why they want to invest in here. I mean, Bob referred to us selling our patrimony to other countries because other countries have put their capital here. That's a vote of confidence in the U.S. economy that they would like to see. They want to invest in the U.S. because they see this as one of the fastest growing, most innovative economies in the world. And that continues regardless of our various challenges, which are serious today. I think the challenge on the global trading system, particularly in the last few decades, is there are always winners and losers. And Bob wrote a really interesting book called No Trade is Free. I politely suggested a better title would have been No Trade Policy is Free, because every trade policy has its trade-offs, and including who gains and who it does not gain from that. And I think trade is in some ways given more credit and more blame than it rightly deserves. Economists have estimated, when you look at dislocation of jobs, including in the Rust Belt, particularly in the Rust Belt, about 80% of which is attributed to automation, not to trade. And about 15% is attributed to trade. And so there is certainly some role there, but where I think our failure has been over the last few decades is less in maintaining the global trading system and more in the fact that we've never had nearly enough attention paid, either in Republican or Democratic administrations, to what needs to be done to ensure that workers can survive and thrive in a rapidly changing economy. Whether that economy is changing because of automation, because of immigration, or because of trade. And I'm not sure it's government programs, because we have a bunch of government programs, and frankly, they're not really worth very much, I'm afraid. But we've never had the creativity put into what needs to be done to really address this issue. And I mention that, or I emphasize that, because if we look at, let's talk about the China entry into the WTO, that is attributed with the so-called China shock to leading to somewhere between 2 and 3 million lost manufacturing jobs over a 12-year period, about 250,000 jobs a year. Now that is a lot, and it is a lot particularly for those people who lost their jobs and the communities in which they worked, which oftentimes had one factory that moved abroad or closed down. But that's tiny in comparison to the expected job dislocation that's currently associated with AI. And yet we're still not spending any serious amount of time in Washington, and I would say even in think tanks or maybe even in universities, thinking through what is the policy response to worker dislocation and how do we make sure that is addressed. The last thing I would say, Mayor, to your question is, the challenge of trade or of globalization more generally is that the benefits are broadly felt, but relatively invisible. Nobody walks out of a Walmart and says, thank goodness for the World Trade Organization. And yet, over these decades, the various trade rounds, multilateral, regional, bilateral, have allowed particularly low-income Americans to provide the necessary goods for their families at a smaller and smaller percentage of their disposable income. And what we're seeing right now in this experiment with tariffs, and we'll see what the effect is over time, is that it is likely to be felt by the people least able to pay for it. As Merritt said, the average applied tariff has gone from 2.5% to about 17%. Imports from China face right now about a 57% tariff across the board, some in more sectors than in others. And it's very unclear to me, while some goods are very strategic and we should talk about where tariffs and protectionism might be appropriate going forward, some goods are strategic, and we need to look beyond efficiency to issues like diversification of supply chains and national security implications of supply chains. It's very unclear to me that it's strategic that we make T-shirts and sneakers and socks and underwear in the United States, and instead we're imposing that cost on low-income Americans. And I just use that as one example, but we now have, Trump won, the administration imposed tariffs fairly targeted, steel, aluminum, a variety of other sectors. Now it's across the board, and we're going to see what the impact is, not just in those sectors, which we should talk about, but also more generally for the American public.
Well, thank you. I'd like, if I would invite Bob to say another word about, there is, I think, a pretty widespread debate about the role of trade versus automation, job loss in America. And I think, we've been debating for decades, what more could we do as a nation to affect, to help communities that have been particularly hard hit, and trade adjustment assistance has really not been successful. So as you think about that trade automation combination, could you just offer a little thinking about how you think about that, and how does tariffs help us Where does it take us as a nation that you think is the right place?
So first of all, I mean, my operating assumption is that the purpose of economic policy should not just be to get the cheapest consumption, right? That's like, I think that we are better off with families staying together and strong communities. And if the T-shirt costs $5 more or 5 cents more, that's a trade-off I would make in a heartbeat, and it's the trade-off that most people make. The notion that you can just pick, I'm just trying to go through the various things on, we're going to get to the part we agree on, I suspect, but it'll probably be sports or something. But it's unlikely to be in this area. Although I guess we both agree that it's I don't know, we don't even, you started your argument.
We actually agree on a lot.
The system is in this, but so if you don't believe that having massive trade deficits is a problem, then there's no reason to do anything, right? So when people shift to this notion of, well, there are strategic things that we should deal with, but we will still maintain transferring our wealth overseas. Remember this $26 trillion that we've transferred overseas, it's not only the 26 trillion, it's the future income of that $26 trillion. You're making your children and your grandchildren poorer. And the notion that, well, this is a vote of confidence in people voting overseas. The reason people invest here if you have a trade surplus is this is where you go to spend dollars, right? This is where you go to spend dollars. So I don't think there's any evidence that there is additional investment as a result of these huge trade deficits. If that were the case, then we wouldn't have U.S. companies sitting on billions of dollars, uninvested dollars. What is really happening is these people are coming back because this is where you spend dollars. You spend dollars in the United States, and therefore you've got your choices are ultimately you're going to buy debt, equity, or real estate in the United States. So I think that people who take the view that there isn't a problem with the trade deficit, and if you believe there is, you have to have something that goes across the board. And I tried to articulate why I think this trade system has failed, and one of the principal reasons is these massive, massive trade deficits. Now, in terms of automation, listen, we have had massive amounts of automation in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and we still maintained our working class, right? It's not like it's one or the other. You can have automation and still have lots of manufacturing jobs. It's not like one or the other. What we saw is bumping along 17 or 18, 19 million of these jobs for decades with, I would suggest, now setting aside the AI question, at least as much automation increases in the 70s and 80s as there is now. And we didn't lose these jobs. What you're losing the jobs to is other countries' industrial policy. And the outcomes are very, very bad for the United States. So that's why you need tariffs across the board. Now, in addition, I wouldn't argue there are some things that are strategic and you should do more in those areas, for sure, because national defense is an important part. But the notion that you can just pick out certain sectors and let the massive amount of American workers basically suffer and have society get poorer is not a good option for me. Economics was sort of discovered, if you want, as a science of scarcity, but we're not in that point now. We don't have that problem now. So I'm not one who, I think there are effects of automation, but the notion that you can lay off, and I've read some of these studies, and it won't surprise you to know I don't agree with them at all. The notion that they're sort of making these kinds of allocations between how much of it is trade, how much of it is automation. You can create new jobs in automation. For one, I think that AI is going to lead to more new jobs than it's going to lose. So I think
But there'll be dislocation in the process.
that's more or less what's happened in America.
I mean, the
over a long
2
period
to
of
3
time.
million people who lost their jobs also got new jobs.
Well, when we say 2 million people, we went from about 17 million manufacturing jobs to 12. So now, economists or whoever does this stuff make some kind of an allocation, but the numbers are it's 5 million jobs that we basically lost as a result of this very, very bad gamble.
I'm going to get to what we agree on in a second, but that decline in manufacturing jobs parallels almost exactly the decline of manufacturing jobs in Germany, which is seen as a great manufacturing powerhouse. It's what happens when automation is introduced to manufacturing, right? And nobody's saying that Germany's not a great manufacturing country, but the same percentage decline in both jobs and percentage of GDP. Now, let's talk about what we agree on, by the way.
But by the way, can you build into this, where are these new tariffs going to lead us? Do we think this is going to lead us to significant more manufacturing employment? We clearly seeing manufacturing productivity, but manufacturing employment?
Can I?
Yeah, for sure, I think that's the result. But
So let's go through that. So first, I agree with Bob very much that the real new, not so new factor, it goes back in some ways to Japan in the late 80s, but certainly China in the 2000s, has been the fact that, and probably Korea sprinkled in there as well over time, other countries engaged in concerted policies of protectionism, industrial policy, subsidization, and export-led growth. And that did have a distortive effect on the global economy, and including on production in the United States. And the question is how to deal with that. So tariffs is certainly one response. But to go to Merritt's question, we now have tariffs in place. Our trade deficit, if you look month by month, and I'm going to discount, I'm going to take the first few months of this year because there was a big surge of imports that made the trade deficit look even worse because companies were expecting tariffs would come, and so they imported a lot of products while they were still tariff-free. But when you look, let's say the last 4 months and the same 4 months last year and the same 4 months the year before, the trade deficit hasn't changed in goods. It's about $95 billion a month in the U.S. And so now you've got tariffs, 17%. They've been in place since since April or so. And the trade deficit, if that's your measure of success, has not changed. If manufacturing jobs are your measure of success, we have 33,000 fewer manufacturing jobs this year so far than we had last year. So it's not creating manufacturing jobs. I think that's going to be the real test, because to President Trump's credit, as Merritt laid out, as a source of leverage, I think tariffs have been incredibly effective. It's brought countries to the table to negotiate any number of issues, whether it's fentanyl or migration or economic issues. As a source of revenue, it's been quite effective, about $190 billion collected so far this year. Not as much as some people who said this is going to be a substitute for income taxes, or this is going to pay for the $2 trillion of tax cuts that were in the big, beautiful bill, but it's still a significant increase in revenue collected through tariffs than existed a year before. But if the third motivation, which I had thought was the primary motivation, which is to remanufacture the U.S. economy, to increase the percentage of GDP that goes into manufacturing, and to increase the percentage of jobs or the number of jobs in manufacturing, so far it has not succeeded. The percentage of manufacturing has gone from 9.8 to 9.4% of our economy, and jobs have gone down by 33,000.
So whenever I hear this summary, I don't know if any of you remember or read Profiles in Courage. In my generation, everyone would have read it. It was this great book by, I see some heads nodding, by John Kennedy. But in it, he has an anecdote that he talks about a congressman named McGrody from California. And he wrote a letter, and Kennedy's saying, we all wish we could write this letter. At this point, Kennedy is a senator. And the letter is something like this: one of the disadvantages of being in Congress is that I have to receive letters from jackasses like you who tell me that I ran for re-election on on the platform that I would reforest the Sierra Madre Mountains. I've been in office 5 months and I haven't reforested them. Please take 3 running jumps and go to hell. That's approximately a quote of the letter. So whenever I hear this, in the first place, I get this sort of notion that you'll recall all the people that Mike has cited said we were going to have massive inflation and a depression by now, and we'd all be out of work, most of us starved and dead. But now, since none of that happened, they have kind of shifted to, well, look at this. I mean, you haven't built a new auto plant, and these tariffs have been in place for 3 months. And you're like, whoa, time out. Nobody really expected that. So what do you look at? You look at things like purchases on manufacturing and the kind of things that you would expect to see early on in a industrial rejuvenation. And you do see that. But it's all going to be a question of looking at green shoots and saying this is a green shoot and this is in fact working. But no rational person really believes that you are going to reindustrialize America and start in April and have it reindustrialized in October. I mean, there's just literally no sense in that at all. So whenever I hear those kinds of things, I'm like, but on the negative side, all the very smart people on the other side did predict all these things and say they would happen immediately, right? And of course, none of them have really happened. So there's like a credibility gap there. My guess is that, I mean, one of the things I finished, I said, listen, you got it wrong for 30 years. Let's do something different for a couple of years. And then if that doesn't work, we can always go back to the failed policy that we had for all these years before. That's kind of more or less where I am. Let's wait 2 or 3 or 4 years, see if we have rejuvenated Americans' manufacturing, see if young people now have a brighter future and can actually expect to live longer than and be richer than their parents. This is precisely what the situation was in America, really from the revolution until year 2000. That you would expect that. And this is an approach to try to deal with that. And let's wait some period of time before we condemn it based on unrealistic expectations.
Would you have expected?
Let me ask you one more question about tariffs, and then maybe we move to other dimensions, because I think trade policy is not just about tariffs. It's about foreign economic policy, about getting at industrial policy, a lot of things that you alluded to. But let me ask you one more question about tariffs, which is, because the president's tariff policy has been implemented through the use of a novel piece of legislation, the IEPA, that's now, I think, been challenged in litigation, lost in the Court of International Trade, again, also in the Court of Appeals and going to the Supreme Court. And if it is struck down, it will have some profound implications, but there may be other instruments that would get us to the same outcomes. But it could be that it would have real fiscal implications if that funds had to be, $190 billion had to be repaid. It would be a really significant development. I think the president has said that he might attend the hearing because he thinks it's so important. How do you think about this IEPA case, both of you, and whether it is that consequential for the strategy, if you will?
So first of all, let me just underscore your comment. If you look at the 9 rounds of negotiations of trade since the Second World War, what we would call the new system, what those rounds were basically about was reducing tariffs. So you have a number and you reduce it and everybody figures it out and everybody goes there. No one really believes in free trade, because if they did, they would just say, I'll get rid of all my tariffs and I'll have all the benefit. But nobody does that. They go in there and say, you reduce yours a lot and I'll reduce mine a little, right? So there's this kind of odd kind of understanding that we're all really not very serious about what we believe. But there was a reasonable amount of success for those 9 periods of time. Largely, it was the United States buying the round by reducing more than other people, and then ultimately the UK and some others, and then Europe to do that. But What you got to as you got into the rounds, you got to the second to the last round, it's the Tokyo round, and the last round was in 1996, the Uruguay round. So what you found was you ran out of tariffs to cut. So they tried to start talking about non-tariff barriers. And the reality is, it's a myth that you can negotiate non-tariff barriers, because the imagination of man is the only limit to people coming up with new ones. So if you think about it, industrial policy, it's banking, it's labor, it's whether or not you enforce environmental laws, it's safety standards, it's currency manipulation, it's tax policy. It's not realistic to think you can negotiate all of those things for every country in the world in the lifetime of anyone here in this room. So it really, tariffs are, in terms of the international trade system, a very small part of what the problem is. The problem is people have gotten smart and they have a whole different policy. In terms of the IEPA, there are a number of statutes the president has that he can raise tariffs. Remember, tariff authority is given in the Constitution to the legislative body. The legislative body then delegates this to the executive in certain circumstances, and there are several statutes that he can use. When I put tariffs with the president on China in the first term, we used Section 301, and we were sued 4,000 times, and we won those lawsuits. There were some others. We used 232, which is one that's kind of a national security sort of thing, and those lawsuits have been won also. If you're going to go across the board, the president decided the simplest one would be IEPA, which is the International Economic Emergency Powers Act. And basically, if you read the statute, it seems to say if the president declares an economic emergency, he can do, you would say regulate, but it's like if you imagine it, and Jack and I worked on the Hill, it would be like people sitting around and saying, let's give him more authority. Let's just make it in this case, in this, and this, and this. And you can see through it's this awkward group of words that are designed really to give the president a lot of power. It's probably worth, just for everybody very quickly, this act was passed in the mid-'70s after President Nixon put in place tariffs on the whole world, because we probably don't remember this, but those of you who study economics, there was basically, we were running trade deficits, the value of gold was too low, people were now running back into the United States and trying to buy $35 gold, where the real value of gold was much higher, and so the trade deficits were leading to a run on gold, and Nixon had a real economic crisis. So he put in place tariffs. That was litigated over a period of time. He negotiated his way out of it. The tariffs went away. And then Congress wanted to make sure that this authority was somehow structured, and that's how they came up with this bill. It's a case, I would say the litigation before the Supreme Court has kind of two sides to it. One side, I think that those who criticize the president's action are on very shaky grounds, and that is where they're saying that the fentanyl tariffs, that the tariffs are not close enough linked to the actual tariffs to have an impact. It's kind of saying the connection's not clear enough. I think they're going to lose on that, because if you bought that argument that there had to be a clear connection between the tariffs and what you're attacking, then all the sanctions would go away, right? You wouldn't, because there's no real connection between Iran's nuclear system and tariffs, and between the war in Europe and tariffs. And so I think they're going to lose on that. The other part, which is the more interesting part, is this question of whether or not tariffs are identified as something the president can do. Now, he clearly has the power to regulate, the power to stop importation of products, and it goes on and on and on and on and on. I keep it on my phone, but I won't read it to anyone now, but I keep it on my phone. It's like one of these paragraphs that I would have written trying to say more and more and more. So the Court of Appeals said the power to regulate does not mean the power to tariff, and therefore you don't have the authority. And then they initially have this separate question where they say this is a major question. It's so significant, Congress had an obligation to make it very clear if they were going to give this power. So The question is, can the president, he has the power to regulate, he has the power to stop the stuff from coming in, but can he put tariffs in place? There was a very strong dissent in the Court of Appeals, which kind of gave credibility to the other side's argument. In honesty, I believe the president has a better side of the argument, but it's one of those things. It's not as clear as you might like it to be. But the notion that you could put a quota on steel, but not put tariffs on steel, or not have a tariff rate quota on steel, is kind of it's kind of an odd concept for me. But nonetheless, that's where the Court of Appeals came out. We'll know probably by the end of the year. And to your point, Mary, you're right. There will be a very large refund, which will have fiscal impact. And it'll be interesting to sort of see how all that happens, because they're going to have to, if they strike it down, they're going to have to give all that money back. But then the president has other authorities which he can use, I believe, quite clearly to accomplish the same thing, with some studies and some, there's some hoops you'll have to jump through, but I think he'll be able to put it in place. But there will be this sorting out of a lot of different processes that you're going to have to go through. And I think they're in the process of doing right now, in the chance that it does in fact happen.
Thank you very much. Well, I'd like to move on to China, unless you have a further comment on either.
I'd only say I agree with Bob's, particularly on his last point,
Yeah.
Which is there's a lot of noise around this. At the end of the day, if the president wants to increase tariffs, he's got lots of different authorities to do it. He will, and I think other countries are sort of prepared for that.
Yeah, and they'll find, but there will be an important case, and we should pay attention to what happens that will implicate the approaches going forward. Let's turn to China. Of course, Ambassador Lighthizer negotiated the Phase 1 agreement. There was a lot in there about purchases from the United States, but there were also intellectual property and market access provisions, if I remember. You also negotiated with China, I believe. And now, of course, we're heading into a moment of quite a lot of tension between the U.S. and China. A number of steps have been taken by the United States to restrict Chinese investment, outbound as well. The relationship has become much more adversarial. I'm wondering what each of you think is the right approach for addressing our national concerns with China at this time from an economic and economic security perspective.
Well, I mean, I'm happy to talk about that, and then we won't have any time left, so why don't I let Mike talk, and
Okay,
I'll
Mike.
talk about it every time it's left. I'll correct
So
any
I'm
misconception.
actually quite sympathetic with the Trump administration's decision to terminate a bunch of the dialogues that Jack and I spent so many hours on, the strategic and economic dialogue, the strategic economic dialogue, because I think we spent thousands of person hours on these things to produce a communique that didn't really move the needle in terms of Chinese behavior, but it did create mechanisms of communication. And I think right now the greatest concern is that the communication in many ways is broken down. Some of the people on the trade team are talking to the trade folks, but we have also other issues with China, like the South China Sea, like Taiwan, like non-proliferation in North Korea, like with their support for Russia in its war against Ukraine. And you don't have that kind of dialogue that's going on. You have a lot of distrust. Look, I think for years we tried to encourage China to change its economic strategy, to move from an export-led strategy supported by subsidization, industrial policy, and protectionism, to more of a domestic demand-led, consumer-led economic strategy. And I think while making modest progress, I'd say it was only modest. And I think now the challenge, and over those years, we would say to the Chinese, we would remind them that their incredible economic success was made possible because of a benign international environment that allowed them to grow through exports, and that if they didn't address these irritants in our relationship, these serious issues in our relationship, that benign international environment would go away, and that's exactly what's happened. And now you have more or less a bipartisan consensus that is much less benign towards China. It's a little less clear what we do from here. If we're not going to get them to change their strategy, then all we can do is, one, try and change the environment in which they operate. And tariffs is one way of doing it. I think working with allies and partners to have common perspectives on how to deal with China is going to be absolutely critical. That was frankly one of the ideas behind TPP. But whether it's TPP or something else, a coalition of the willing on export controls or on rules around industrial policy or whatever it is, critical minerals, that there needs to be work with our allies and partners. And one can debate, how best to go about doing that so that we have a common view vis-a-vis China. And then I think it is some degree, whether you call it de-risking or selective decoupling, where you say there are certain sectors where we are just not going to trade with them, whether it's high technology that could be used in a dual use fashion to support their military or intelligence capabilities, or other areas. But then take a step back and say, but there's lots of trade that can and should happen for the benefit of both economies. I go back to my t-shirts and sneakers. I don't really see any reason why we can't buy our t-shirts and sneakers from China. And ideally that they would buy things from us, not just soybeans and corn, and beef and pork and commodities. We're not a third world country that only have commodities for sale, but other products as well that they could use as well. So I think there is work to be done there. I lament that there isn't, and maybe this will come out of a summit meeting between President Trump and President Xi, a more concerted effort to create the kinds of communication channels that can have an honest discussion, not just for show, but an honest discussion about what the differences are between the countries and some concrete ways to resolve them, whether that's between military and military folks so that we're not having accidents in the South China Sea or in the Taiwan Straits, or to deal with some of these fundamental economic issues.
Well, thank you. I think you've managed to embed in there some elements I was hoping we could get to, but time is too short, which is to identify what do we need to design for the trading system of the future, in which you allude to this coalitions of the willing. Could I invite Ambassador Lighthizer to take a moment, though, to also comment on what you see as China and more broadly as we think about the future going forward? Just a moment.
So I'll do this very briefly. First of all, I always go back to first principles. First principles with respect to China has got to be, are they a hostile geopolitical adversary, or are they basically Switzerland waiting to be unveiled, right? To me, if you look at what they're doing militarily, at the territorial claims, at the funding these wars, at their own stated words about aggression, times not seen since for 100 years, changes not seen for 100 years. If you look at the fentanyl sales in the United States, if you look at all these things, you have to conclude that they are a geopolitical, the technology theft and the espionage and all of these very aggressive steps. So if you assume then that they are a geopolitical adversary, then you need something that I call strategic decoupling. That is to say, trade with them, but not in technology. It's got to be balanced, and it's got to be in the interest of the United States or the West. So, and I could elaborate on that at some length, but I don't have time. I don't have some length. So the final thing on this, what's a new system? In my opinion, a new system has to be countries that are reasonably democratic, reasonably economically liberal, getting together and having an agreement where they're going to end up with balanced trade, not balanced trade with each other, but balanced trade globally, so that if you make a decision to do something to help your own country, you can't externalize the cost to it and have some other country pay for it. You make these decisions for your own internal cohesion, and then you live with the costs. And if you had a system like that, I think it's a system that could endure for a long time. The alternative is all these negotiations, which I propose, I suggest are impossible to do successfully. So you need an objective, which is balance, global balance, over a period of time. And if you do that, I think you're going to end up with economic efficiencies that are the benefits of trade that we've all talked about.
Well, I think in each of your remarks, I see elements of agreement and substantial elements of a disagreement, but I think you can all agree that we need another hour, which we don't have. Please join me in thanking our distinguished guests.